were two things that you were supposed to read for today. One was a pop culture article on Nietzsche, and the other was the introduction to Jung's book, which is a few pages long. So I'm going to do a little bit of a warm-up here to introduce course kind of overview stuff, and then we'll start talking about our readings. There we go. So this is, of course, on Nietzsche, obviously. Need to update here. So Nietzsche, 19th century German philosopher, philologist, classicist, psychologist. He goes by different labels. He was trained in classics. And in this course, we'll study excerpts from major works, studied in the context of the three periods of his productive thought. So it's basically just gets divided up like lots of philosophers between early, middle, and late works, right? That kind of thing. Nietzsche has not always been considered a kind of canonical Western philosopher for a lot of, he's more so now, and definitely kind of now, but probably earlier in the 20th century prior to Kaufmann trying to rehabilitate Nietzsche after the Nazis. And with a really existentialist reading of Nietzsche, he kind of started rehabilitating him a little bit. And he's, gained more attention amongst philosophers. As soon as we start reading Nietzsche next week, you'll understand why, because he doesn't write like most philosophers write. It's more literary and stuff like that. And we'll have to worry about that. That means we'll often have to struggle and interpret what Nietzsche's actual arguments are. Right? So he's one of those thinkers who challenges notions of what philosophy is and how to go about doing it. As I mentioned here. And he often espouses views that are at odds with the sort of, and if this doesn't make perfect sense today, don't worry about it, but the kind of Platonism that runs throughout much of Western philosophy. That includes mind-body dualisms, the idea that consciousness is separate from the body, but related to it somehow, that there are objective moral truths, this sort of stuff, right? And so why study Nietzsche? Sometimes people think that he should not be studied. Isn't he a horrible person? I have here, neo-Nazis are claiming Nietzsche as their own. There's these two brothers that lived and then killed some people inspired by Nietzsche. We got a picture of Hitler admiring a bust of Nietzsche there as well. He says all sorts of things. Let me actually do this one since it's got like a little thing for it here.
Years there is a controversy over whether to study or pointing out that years there is a controversy over whether to study or cancel Nietzsche. That seems to pop up most recently. A college in London wanted to ban the Nietzsche Club, and
right, so we got here
I think it
people
was out in
at universities wanting to cancel Nietzsche.
The Nietzsche Club was
because
banned,
he was a misogynist, Hitler,
because Nietzsche is allegedly
inspiration
fascist,
and so
sexist,
forth.
and
so should he
homophobic.
express his views that are
And of course,
many
many
consider
religious people have been
sexist,
deeply
for
troubled by
example.
Nietzsche for a long, long
that sort of
time.
thing.
So yes, Nietzsche is a very controversial figure. I
mentioned he's associated with Nazis, but he's also been associated with anarchism. So, and we need to pick up on this. This is Emma Goldman, who is a female anarchist writer, and she points out, or she claims about Nietzsche, and this will be one of the things we have to worry about all semester. He's associated with Nazism. Nazism doesn't respect individual rights or individuality. It's about a kind of collectivism, right? And contrary to that, we have Goldman here saying that he's a kind of anarchist. So, Nazis love authority, anarchists don't. So she says here, I point out that Nietzsche was not a social theorist, but a poet, a rebel, and an innovator. His aristocracy was neither of birth nor of the purse. We'll have to worry about Nietzsche's elitism, certainly. It was of the spirit. So there's the individualism. In that respect, Nietzsche was an anarchist, and all true anarchists were aristocrats in that sense of a spiritual self-mastery, right? One way to study Nietzsche's philosophy, and certainly a way that many have gone about trying to do that and show how he does have things to say about philosophical issues. And I've done this in a version of the class previously as well. We could worry about the main subfields of philosophy: epistemology, metaphysics, aesthetics, logic, political philosophy, and ethics up at the top, and see, how does Nietzsche answer those basic questions in those areas, reconstruct his arguments from them, and then proceed from there. So that's certainly one way to do. We'll do a little bit of that in this class. He's influenced subsequent philosophy, both in the European tradition, so that's the existentialists, and then post-structuralists, the people that came after that, like Michel Foucault, Heidegger, Sartre. Anglophone philosophy, he's been an influence, particularly in metaethics. And we'll have to worry about the Anglophone reception of Nietzsche. That's the first thing that Jung is starting to point out in her book. And also comparative philosophy. So you can find some works on like Nietzsche and Eastern thought as well. Last time I did the class, and I'm going to go ahead and mention it this time, we focused on Nietzsche as a philosopher who understood philosophy not as an academic discipline, but as a way of life. Right? So Sellers is a philosopher that talked about this idea of philosophy. So again, not an academic discipline, but a way of life. He says, can we flesh out this notion further? I take it to involve the following things. First, that the ultimate motivation of philosophy is to transform one's way of life. Second, that there ought to be some connection and consistency between someone's stated philosophical ideas and their behavior. And third, that actions are ultimately more philosophically significant than words. It's often conceived as something therapeutic, but it need not be. It usually aims at the good life, but again, this may not necessarily be so. It is transformative, though. Perhaps one ought not to assume that this will always be for the better. This morning in my earlier class, we worried about whether philosophy corrupts people. That's transformation, but Socrates was accused of corrupting them. So it resonates with that, what Isaiah Berlin called the power of ideas. That is the ability of philosophy to transform the life of the individual or even an entire society. As he put it, the concepts and categories with which people think must deeply affect their lives. And then picking up on that idea from Sellers, who's again a contemporary philosopher, here's what Nietzsche said about philosophy as a way of life. This comes from Schopenhauer as educator, which is part of the Untimely Meditations. We're going to focus on the use and abuse of history, not the Schopenhauer's educator, although Jung is going to talk about the Schopenhauer stuff as well. So Nietzsche says in that essay, I attach importance to a philosopher only to the extent that he is capable of setting an example. The philosopher must supply his example in his visible life and not merely in his books. That is, it must be presented in the way the philosophers of ancient Greece taught, through facial expressions, demeanor, clothing, food, and custom, more than through what they said, let alone what they wrote. So to give a kind of more radical example of that, Diogenes, who didn't write anything down, but his way of life was supposed to exemplify his cosmopolitanism and his values, right? And we will go through, again, several of Nietzsche's major works. I didn't list, this is from last semester, I didn't list The Case of Wagner, but we will read a little bit of that this time around as well. I usually haven't included that, but since there's a chapter on it, we'll cover it here. Since there's a chapter out of the Young book. So we'll look at Birth of Tragedy. That's where Nietzsche does deal with aesthetics and the philosophy of art. We'll worry about the Untimely Meditations, Human All Too Human, where we get his first critique of religion starting to come out, as well as in Daybreak. The subtitle of Daybreak is on Thoughts and Prejudices of Morality. So morality is a kind of prejudice, right? We'll look at the Joyful Science, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, on the Genealogy of Morals, then The Case of Wagner, Twilight of the Idols, Antichrist, and Ecce Homo. Sometimes in this middle and early period, Sometimes you'll see scholars saying that this is Nietzsche's positive period. It's where he emphasizes what he's in favor of. And then the second stuff, start with Beyond Good and Evil after Zarathustra, is more of his full critique of morality. So you do have people dividing the things up, the works up in that way, or the periods of his philosophy up in that way. We've got some main themes or doctrines. I put that in quote marks there. But the main themes and doctrines associated with Nietzsche's philosophy include life affirming versus life denying. That'll run through just about everything. Pessimism and nihilism are going to be in the background of everything as well. Art, tragedy, and existence. Again, birth of tragedy, but Nietzsche is often said to have reject moral values and substitute aesthetic values for them. So we'd want to worry about what that means. We'll have to worry about his critique of culture and cultural decline, perspectivalism and truth, and whether those are the same things as relativism or not. We'll, of course, worry about God's death, Superman, the Overman, self-creation, self-overcoming, the eternal return. It's a big thought experiment there. And his critique of morality and religion, of course, that idea of master-slave morality is a big idea there. Also, we'll have to worry about the will to power, which is a central notion in Nietzsche, very controversial. It sounds like an authoritarian kind of thing, but we'll have to worry about that. And then lastly, amor fati, love of fate, right? Becoming what one is. So we'll have several main themes to be paying attention to all semester long. It's often helpful to try and pick one big one and kind of follow it all the way through the books to help you organize stuff, right? So some basic questions, right, to worry about. What exactly is Nietzsche's philosophy? I've already talked about how one way to try to answer that is to think about the basic questions in each of the subfields and then see what Nietzsche has to say about it. So what is knowledge? Well, Nietzsche claims that not all knowledge and knowing is perspectival. What does that mean, right? We can worry about the values that inform his philosophy as a way of life, and that'll be in the background of a lot of what we do this semester as well, even focusing on the philosophy of religion part. And then, is it coherent, plausible, or reasonable, or true? Or is it relativistic, self-contradictory, fallacious, and a bunch of sophistry, right? So we'll have to worry about those sorts of things. The next reading is not on Nietzsche proper, it's on relativism and self-contradiction. So we'll get some of that in the background, and we'll have a setup to worry about that problem all semester long. And so that'll kind of get us started. So our plan is basically to go through several of the major works, again listed on the schedule, and then there's a couple of additional readings. Most of the secondary readings are out of this, so these are our two main things for the semester. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into Nietzsche in pop culture here. And let's see, let's just do it this way. We'll start with some class participation. And let's see, let's do blue. And we'll talk a lot about, I'm going to call it like the received view of Nietzsche in Anglophone philosophy, that you should recognize that already since Jung has mentioned that. So let's just call it the received view or interpretation of Nietzsche. And primarily what Jung is worried about is Anglophone philosophy. So the English-speaking world of philosophy, or, you know, another way of saying it with a broad term, analytic philosophy, right? And then have to start worrying about Jung's interpretation as well. So let's just go around the room here. And again, we'll do some participation stuff. They're in alphabetical order. All right, good. So like if we think about, and I'll just project this back up here. We could do whether the Joker, right, he's transgressive, right? Is he a good example of the Ubermensch or not? And again, I'm just asking broadly, as well as, given the pop culture article, what familiarity with Nietzsche's philosophy do you have, if any? It's okay if it's none. However, at least be able to explain what interests you or why. We can skip that one. How are Nietzsche's ideas portrayed generally in your articles, right? In those pop culture articles. Did your selected article characterize Nietzsche's philosophy? Was it more individualist or was it more communitarian? That's going to be an important thing for us. And then what key themes, ideas did the author emphasize? We talked about some of those already. And then how did that author use pop culture to illustrate or explain those ideas, right? Those are the sorts of things you want to make sure and have down. And just as a quick kind of run through thing here, here's my pop culture and Nietzsche reference. Right, there are often explicit references to Nietzsche in movies and television shows. Do you know who Bronze Age pervert is by any chance? Do you know who this is? It's a person who had a, maybe still has, I don't know. And I have got the dude's book. He's a graduate of Yale, poli-sci. But he presents like a kind of Nietzsche as beat the crap out of other people kind of thinker, right? Yeah, this kind of thing, right? So that's a very common view. It's more like, yeah, Nietzsche was a Nazi and it's a good thing, or a proto-Nazi and was a good thing. That's basically what this dude is arguing. It's called Philosophy and Selective Breeding is the name of the book. And then if you notice anything about Nietzsche in pop culture, just the way it's often presented, if you know the movie Clueless, the dark, brooding college student is reading Nietzsche by the pool in black clothes and sunglasses, right? He's got the portable Nietzsche there. Lots of movies have these sorts of themes about individualism, transgressiveness, nihilism, in them. So you see that in Fight Club, where they're being violent to one another because they're rejecting consumerist society, right? They have these ideas about what a man is supposed to look like, what masculinity is. American Beauty nihilism is running through that whole thing. Have y'all ever seen American Beauty? It's good but dark. Came out near the same time as Fight Club. These are all from the 90s, so I'm dating myself here, right? The Big Lebowski, there's nihilists in The Big Lebowski. They believe in nothing, right? That Hurly Burly has a lot of nihilism and pessimism running throughout it. It's a very dialogue-driven show where the guy's constantly worrying about whether he's successful or not, and just very confused about what success would mean in Hollywood and this sort of thing. We've read about whether Bart Simpson is a good example of the Ubermensch, or whether maybe the Joker would be. And again, we can do the same thing. Nihilism is all the way through the first season of True Detective. If you haven't seen that, there's even Time is a Flat Circle, and they ask if there's about Nietzsche in there. And that was the one by the way, that's the one that's was made here about South Louisiana. If you haven't seen that one. Y'all familiar with BoJack Horseman? Nihilism is all the way through that whole show, right? Same thing with Rick and Morty in the multiverse, right? And then same thing in Watchmen as well, where we had Ozymandias, this example of the Ubermensch or not, because he's got this plan for world peace, and it involves like killing some innocents, like billions of them along the way, right? So Nietzsche's all the way through this pop culture. You can find stuff like on Cracked. Do y'all know that website, Cracked? Like what Hollywood gets wrong about Nietzsche is another kind of thing there, right? And so what we get out of a lot of that pop culture stuff that y'all read for today is very close to the received view of Nietzsche. And so if you look just in this introduction here from Young, which is the second piece to read for today. Well, I'll come back to that. So we've got him down. He's pretty clearly presented as a kind of radical individualist in that pop culture stuff, right? Some other things we would worry about is that Nietzsche is often elitist. Anti-democratic. This is the aristocracy stuff, which again sounds kind of authoritarian. When he talks about the will to power, is he talking about dominating others? Is that what he means? He's an atheist. After all, what's the quote everybody knows about Nietzsche? God is dead, right? God is dead. So we got radical individualist, elitist, anti-democratic, authoritarian, emphasizing will to power. Again, that just sounds like, if you don't know the German, if you don't bother to think about what it means in German or what words he was using in German, it looks like, well, that's just imposing yourself on others, right? That's what that sounds like. And of course, he's said to be an atheist, right? Probably, people flip out because what they know about Nietzsche is that he's an atheist, and that's why you shouldn't read him, right? That sort of thing. So, as Jung points out here, and I'll start with this passage. This is just at the very bottom of page 1. And this is, again, you can get the physical copy. The electronic copy is linked on Moodle for you, so you can get away without having to buy it. And I'm going to skip the parts where she talks about ideals and music here. And Jung says, realizing I had no answer to these questions, I undertook a systematic reading of Nietzsche's text for a graduate seminar in Upland in the first semester of 2004. To me at least, initially startling answer that emerged that Nietzsche was in fact never abandoned his commitment to religious communitarianism. To the end, such is the argument of this book, Nietzsche's fundamental concern, his highest value, lies in the flourishing of community. And to the end, he believes that this can happen only through the flourishing of communal religion. Right? So in two ways, this reading runs counter to nearly all Anglophone interpretations of Nietzsche. Right? So the secondary book is going to basically question what most of us think about Nietzsche. That's why I picked it, make us think about it, right? So in two ways, this reading runs counter to nearly all Anglophone interpretations. Again, what we're going to call the received view of Nietzsche here. As a radical individualist, also a nihilist, at least of a sort, an elitist, anti-democratic, authoritarian domination, and an atheist, right? And individualism usually means you are not a communitarian, right? So first, while most conclude from his scathing assaults on established religions in general and on Christianity in particular, he's also going to have some stuff to say about Buddhism. He also says Buddha's dead. So we got to worry about that one too now. That's in the gay science, and we'll have to work up to that. So first, while most conclude from his scathing assaults on established religions in general and on Christianity in particular, as well as the naturalistic tenor of his later thought, that Nietzsche was quite obviously an atheist. I hold, this is Jung saying, speaking in their own voice here. I don't know if Jung is I don't know if Julian is a male or female scholar. I'll have to look that up. So I hold he never was. That he never was an atheist.
I know he used to be Christian. I don't know if
His parents, his dad was and his grandfather too, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. You have to check me off the top of my head here. Were Lutheran ministers. He trained to be a Lutheran minister. So Jung holds that Nietzsche was never an atheist. That's directly contrary to what most of us think, right? Though atheistic with respect to the Christian God, Nietzsche, I hold, ought to be regarded as a religious reformer rather than an enemy of religion. Second, while most readings take Nietzsche to be an individualistic philosopher, I take his concern to lie first and foremost with the community. So we'll need to look at, as we start to go through, and again, this will be, let me start Birth of Tragedy next Thursday, a week from today, I think. You need to be paying attention, like as you're going through the primary text. What is he really saying about religion here? What is he rejecting about religion? What is he maybe, according to Jung, affirming about religion? Right? We'll need to worry about what passages support the idea that he is a radical individualist and whether we should weight those more or less than the passage that seem to emphasize something else about community. Same thing with each of these, right? So basically, the picture of Nietzsche that's running throughout all of those pop culture articles is about to get challenged by Jung here, all right? Everybody with me? Everybody good so far? All right, let's talk about how to read Nietzsche. Normally when you read philosophy, and I have a reading handout that's built around this, and it was how I was taught to read philosophy, at least most of it, we need to know the author's thesis, we need to know the author's argument, and why they think this is important. What philosophical work is it doing for us, right? And often when you're reading philosophers, are the arguments explicit?
Yes.
Yeah, a lot of times they're listed formally, right? Listed off as formal arguments like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? We're trained to do that sort of thing. The reason why people study philosophy before they go to law school and stuff like that is because that kind of stuff is central to the practice of academic philosophy and thinking and writing philosophy, right? Nietzsche doesn't write that way. That means we have to worry about interpreting what his arguments are. We have to identify where he's making an argument or the idea of the kernel of an argument and then extrapolate, right? So some reading tips here. I just mentioned those three things. Those will be more prevalent in the secondary sources where the scholars are talking more straightforwardly than Nietzsche does, right? So what's the author's thesis? What reasons, arguments do they give in support of it? And why was it important? Take care, man. So reading Nietzsche, I remark here, is a little different because he didn't write the way many subsequent academics have come to think and expect philosophical writing should be. I don't want you writing like Nietzsche in your papers in this class, right? Take care. All right. So first, we'll have to worry about different genres. Most of the time, his writings do not contain formal arguments of the typical sort that we associate with academic writing in philosophy. He uses essays, aphorisms. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is like a epic poem. I'm always tempted to just cut that book out every time I teach Nietzsche's philosophy because there's no arguments in there, to be honest, like no clear ones anyway. It's written like literature, right? You mentioned looking at the origins of things. Well, Nietzsche is most influential for his genealogical method of doing philosophy that we get out of the genealogy of morals. Michel Foucault picked up on that, many other thinkers as well. He is engaged in historically informed reflection, autobiography. He uses irony and satire. So when Nietzsche says, when you go to the woman, be sure and bring your whip, we need to worry about whether that's a misogynist claim or is he poking fun at the misogyny of his time. We have to worry about stuff like that. When he seems to emphasize anti-democratic things, is he being ironic or not? We're going to have to worry about some of that. But he does give reasons for and against various philosophical views. We need to be on the watch out for those as we're going through those readings. This is why annotating your Nietzsche reading is going to be really important for you. Right?
And he goes on. He says,
so here's Nietzsche
it's not
on
enough
persuasion.
to prove something, just like the philosopher would want to do. He says,
Normally,
one has to seduce or elevate people to it.
When y'all are doing your presentation,
pause there for a second. Does that mean, using sophistry to seduce or elevate people to it instead of rational argumentation? So he says, he goes on, that's why the man of knowledge should learn how to speak his wisdom, and often in such a way that it sounds like folly. Right? So Nietzsche's placing an emphasis on rhetoric there,
or elevate
like the
people
sophists. And this kind of gets us up to speed, or dovetails with, rather, the article.
Considered the opposite of impartial reasoning, correct? Which in philosophy, what we want to do is supposed to be focused on impartial reasoning, right? What happened to my...
And he goes on.
So it's not enough.
It's not enough to prove something.
One
just like
has
the
to
philosopher
seduce or
would want to
elevate
do.
people.
He says one has to seduce or
the
elevate
man of knowledge
people
should
to
learn how to speak his wisdom, and
pause there for a
often
second.
in
Does
such
that
a way
mean,
that it sounds like
using
folly.
sophistry to
So is
seduce
that
or
self-referential? Is Nietzsche telling us what he's up to
rational argumentation?
there? That comes
So he
from
says,
Daybreak.
he goes
Thoughts and
on.
Prejudices
That's why
on Morality.
the man.
He also remarks, the worst readers are those who behave like plundering troops. They take away a few things they can use, dirty and confound the remainder, revile the whole. And also from Daybreak. So is that what analytic philosophers have done to go figure out what his view on epistemic, on perspectivism is, or his view on moral skepticism, right? Need to worry about that kind of thing. So he says, if I conjure up a picture of the perfect reader, he always becomes a monster of courage and curiosity, yet also of subtlety and cunning and prudence, a born adventurer and explorer. That's from Ecce Homo, his autobiography at the end. So reading Nietzsche is going to be difficult, right? I really recommend paraphrasing as you go, marking out key passages where he's introducing one of those main doctrines or discussing those doctrines. Those are the things to pay extra special attention to when you're reading this stuff. Because he's not going to just come out and tell you what he wants you to think or what he wants to say. Not all the time, anyway. So, again, key doctrines to worry about and main things. Apollonian Dionysian, the religious communitarian stuff that Jung is going to argue for is rooted in that Dionysian stuff, which goes all the way. It's introduced early, but he talks about it all the way through his writings. The death of God, the eternal return, again, overman and self-creation, master-slave morality, perspectivism, and skepticism, right? Again, Nietzsche is often associated with existentialism, right? The meaning of existence and those kind of philosophers. And they were basically all individualists, right? And then the critique of Platonism, there's the critique of the dualism kind of stuff. He's going to challenge the idea that philosophers could ever be objective about their metaphysical or epistemic views. So we're going to have to worry about that. And of course, we need to worry about his critique of morality and religion in particular, since that's the main theme that Jung is worried about here. And then another big thing to worry about is the substitution of aesthetic values for traditional moral values, which would be associated with like nuclear family and Christianity and this kind of stuff, versus what is pleasing to me. Right. All right. What kinds of questions do we have about Nietzsche so far? I know we're not very far into it, or about the class so far. Right. Great quote from Nietzsche, the surest way to corrupt the youth, remember that there's our Socrates line, right, is to instruct him to hold in higher esteem those who think alike than those who think differently. So we need to worry as we go through these major excerpts of his works. We'll do that chronologically along with the secondary text. Keep your eye out for those ideas. Be sure and note passages where it looks like he's either gesturing or has the kernel idea of an argument, right? So if this, then that kind of stuff, or either ors. Worry about that. Worry about how he developed some of those major themes, like the Dionysian stuff, over the course of his works. And then keep an eye out for the main reasons he gives for and against those doctrines. So we're going to have problems interpreting Nietzsche. What is he saying? And why is he saying it? And is that sound or cogent, any of that kind of stuff, right? So that's what we'll be working on. In order to get a good handle on some of that, the next thing we're going to read is not about Nietzsche proper, but about relativism and philosophy. So if you're going to have to read, some of y'all, if you're taking me for more than one class, this will be another thing that you read in those other classes. But where we're going to start here is with this article here, which deals with contradictions and relativism. So I want you to read all of this. This is what's on the schedule. And it's a pop culture article about Colbert. So Colbert, and Colbert here is not the Late Show Colbert, but the Colbert Report Colbert, where he's sarcastic and playing. And so how do we know what his real views are? So that's kind of in there. And then the relativist stuff is in there. So self-contradiction is in there. So you're going to read all of that. He's going to go through and use the law of non-contradiction to critique several possible objections to philosophy, or in some kind of common but maybe not very sophisticated versions of relativism, and show how they're problematic. So read that. This is a little more straightforward. Read 14 through 20 on the law of non-contradiction in there, and the baseline argument for philosophical non-objectivism. Since Nietzsche is going to challenge the idea of objectivity in philosophy, that also dovetails very nicely with what he's going to say about philosophy and philosophers, who he says lack historical sensibility, right? And then complete this lesson. There's a video lecture on law of non-contradiction there. If you've had my class before, it's one of my old lectures on law of on contradictions, the law of non-contradiction, and self-defeating or self-contradictory claims and how to spot them. So that's going to be one of the main critical thinking things we got to do with Nietzsche, as it'll pop up in several different ways about whether he's relativistic and incoherent as a result of it, right? And then if you need, how many people are all philosophy majors and minors again? Most of you. If you need a refresher or have not taken a basic critical thinking and logic class, I've got additional resources for you down here. All of my basic lessons on intro to logic and fallacies and so forth are in there. But I included in this it's really like a third video in there on Nietzsche fallacies, particularly ad hominem and genetic fallacy. Because one of Nietzsche's criticisms of Socrates is going to be that he's ugly. Well, that seems like an ad hominem. So what are we doing with these ad hominems? And there's also a question about where he does this origins of things and tries to trace the origins of morality, whether he's committing what's called the genetic fallacy in there. So I go over those two things that are particularly important for Nietzsche in there as well as relativism. And then we'll do like a little worksheet and kind of reflection exercise about whether, what does Johnson, that first article, say? How does he critique some of these views? And then how does this apply to Nietzsche's philosophy? Because I'll pop out a famous line. He says, "There are no facts, only interpretations," which sounds like an endorsement of a kind of relativism, right? And then we have often running about whether it's coherent or not, right? Makes some sense, right? Any questions about what to do for next?